said earlier, that reservoir had a hole in it, was not suitable. We looked around our museum grounds and we found we had a lot of air reservoirs, too big and too small. Well, this one was the right diameter, so it would fit in that area where it was originally, but it's longer. Now, we had room because beyond the end of that is where the original air compressor hung. At some point, and probably fairly early in the locomotive's life, sometime after 1920, they put the air compressor up in one of the hoods. And so this is, there was a space here that was used for nothing. So we were able to put a reservoir on that was about a foot longer than the original, and we had room to do it. Some people had said, well, why don't you get new ones made? But number one, the new ones would not look like the old ones, and number two, they would be quite expensive, and these are just fine. And if anybody years from now wants to get a new one made, they can do it, but meanwhile it will be done. Talk about the wiring is the last thing to be done. It's somewhat flexible anyway. There are bundles made up of fire hose and friction tape, which contain 8 or a dozen wires, and they go from one end of the locomotive to the other. And we will, as a last thing underneath here, we will actually construct the hose, probably put them up on the deck and do it from there, and then fasten them down in between the sills like they were originally, and then we can finally put the deck on. We're close. Wondering about this color that you see on a lot of the wood. That is an imitation. It's Cabot's oil-based barn red stain, which is an imitation of a stain that they used on all of the wood when the car was constructed, and you can see remains of it here and there. There's quite a bit of it showing on the center sills, which are well protected. I don't know how effective it was, but this is 100 years old, and we're scraping off what we can, and wherever we can get at it, we'll put new on. Well, it's pretty awkward getting up inside there. What else was I going to say? The 1¼ inch black rod that you see is the truss rod, and you can see how it angles up toward the front of the car and goes eventually over the bolster. Well, at this point, closer, it's going over the needle beam, or under the needle beam, and it's going through the original casting, the only one of the castings that was left. And that has a slight rounded area, so it fits over the truss rod quite nicely. And then there's a pin cast into it on the top. So we drilled a hole there and pushed it up in. And then we tightened up the big bolts on either end and pulled the truss rods up so that they hold everything quite nicely. One of our difficulties was to try to work around those truss rods with getting air tanks and the blocks and so forth in there, but as you can see, we did figure it out. Things go together almost the way they did originally, but always with a little bit of a challenge, which is what makes the job more interesting.